We've seen in previous lectures that age of exposure to natural measles infection determines the outcome from that infection in many respects. We've also seen that in the context of inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's disease, and ulcerative colitis, that exposure to natural measles virus and perhaps the single measles vaccine may be a determinant of the risk of that disease according to the age at which the infection is contracted. So the next step is to look at autism and age of exposure to measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. Now, here is a certain statement from Dr. Gregory Poland. MMR vaccine does not cause autism. There, once again, is that certainty from vaccinologists about the absence of any relationship between MMR and autism, despite thousands, tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of parents saying, yes, there is. Now, not all children are affected by autism, while MMR is given to virtually all children. One of the recurring questions from scientists, doctors, and the public alike is, everybody gets MMR. Why does everybody not get autism? Why some, not others? Well, based upon our prior observations of age of exposure, could age of exposure to MMR be one determinant, one risk? Why some children, perhaps those who get the vaccine earlier, are at greater risk of developing autism than those who get it later? And again, as with inflammatory bowel disease, there are clues from natural infection. And in Israel, Ring and his colleagues modeled the number of autism births with epidemics of natural measles, rubella, poliomyelitis, viral meningitis, and viral encephalitis. What they found was that children born during epidemics of measles and viral meningitis were at significantly greater risk of developing autism. And looking at the vaccine now, adverse reactions to MMR vaccine, let's go back to that outbreak, that epidemic of meningitis associated with the use of the Urabi-containing MMR vaccine in the mass vaccination campaign in Brazil. And there are clues from that also. You'll remember this graph where we see the background rate of meningitis in children, and then with the mass vaccination campaign, all children in Brazil targeted to be vaccinated with MMR within 1 month, we see this dramatic rise in the rate of meningitis. The findings from that study is that the relative risk of meningitis in the 3 to 5 weeks after MMR vaccination was hugely elevated at 30.4 times the background rate. The incidence was highest in the younger children, in those of 4 to 8 years of age, compared with those of 9 to 11. Now, although there may be a number of explanations for that observation, it does raise the question, are younger children at greater risk of an adverse event following MMR vaccine? In other words, not all children are the same. Their risk of developing an adverse reaction to this vaccine may well be determined by the age of exposure. Now, this has been explored in several ways in studies that have been put forward in the literature and by the vaccinologists, as showing definitively that there is no link between MMR vaccine and autism. But when we test the correct hypothesis, not exposure to MMR per se, but age of exposure, then some very interesting observations emerge. This is a study that came from California and looked at the accumulating numbers of children within the developmental disabilities system there. What they found is for those born during the period 1980 to 1994, there was a marked, sustained increase in autism case numbers, rising from 44 to 208 cases per 100,000 live births. In a remarkably short period of time, 14 years, there was a 373% increase in autism. However, they observed that those immunized with MMR by 24 months only rose by 14%. There was this huge discordance between the 373% rise in autism and the mere 14% increase in the number of children receiving MMR by 24 months of age. And their conclusion was there was no correlation observed between childhood MMR immunization rates in California and the trend in numbers of children with autism. However, this was then reanalyzed. This is the graph from the original study. And what we see here at the top are the uptake rates of the MMR vaccine by 24 months in the solid circles and by 17 months below that in the open circles. And below that we see the dramatic rise in autism numbers within this developmental disabilities service system in California. Now, when we take a closer look at that graph, as Dr. Edwards and Bolton did, they showed that the ratio of children immunized before 17 months of age to those immunized between 17 and 24 months of age increased dramatically by 200% over that same period, 81 to 93. What that meant is that children were getting their MMR vaccine earlier. And what they found is that there was, in fact, a correlation between the rising incidence of autism and earlier MMR vaccination. But it's important to bear in mind that correlation does not equal causation. In this second study from Dr. Rickler and colleagues from Ann Arbor, they examined whether there is a characteristic type of autism that's associated with developmental regression in a previously developmentally normal or near normal child, and intestinal symptoms following MMR vaccination. And you will remember perhaps that in the original Lancet paper, this was the group of children we described. Developmental regression in previously developmentally normal children who, with the onset of the regression, developed gastrointestinal symptoms which reflected an underlying inflammatory bowel disease. So at least for this study, they're trying to tease out that specific subset of children that we originally described. Their findings, most interestingly, were that age of exposure to MMR was significantly lower in this population of children with those symptoms, that's just over 14 months of age, compared with the remaining autistic population who received their MMR at an average of 17.7 months of age. And that difference between the children who got their vaccine earlier and later was statistically significant. Now, at odds with their reported findings, the authors concluded in their paper that there was no evidence that onset of autistic symptoms or of regression was related to MMR vaccination. That's somewhat discordant with their statistical findings. The third study comes from Denmark, and this study, described by the World Health Organization as one of the most conclusive studies proving that there's no link between MMR vaccine and autism, actually shows something very different. And now, notwithstanding the fact that the senior author of this study, responsible for coordination between the CDC, the study sponsor, and the Danish scientist, was Dr. Paul Thorsen, who has subsequently been indicted on 21 charges of wire fraud and embezzlement in relation to this and other vaccine safety studies. Notwithstanding that fact, let's look at the data. What was interesting in when these were reanalyzed by Dr. Sami Suiza from McGill University, the professor of statistics there, he pointed out that according to their own data, the rates of autistic disorder were very different according to the age at vaccination, and much higher in those vaccinated by 35 months of age, that is 21.32 per 10 to the 5, compared with the overall rate of autism in the reference group that received no MMR, only 12 per 10 to the 5. And this again was statistically significant. So in contrast with the reported findings of the study, when the correct hypothesis is tested, age of exposure related to autism, we find that there are significant differences in all of these reported studies. And that really goes some way to help explaining this sort of extraordinary finding that looks at the prevalence of autism in Denmark by year of birth. And what we see is that before the introduction of MMR, there is actually a negative, non-significant but negative growth in the prevalence of autism. And it is precisely with the point of introduction of the MMR vaccine that we see an inflection, an upward turn in the curve, and a substantial increase in the number of children affected by this disorder. a striking finding that may well now be reconciled within the context of the real findings of the Danish study. So in summary, younger age of exposure to MMR appears to increase the autism risk.